Hello, I'm Ryan Black, and welcome to another audio walkthrough. Today, we are going to be looking at routing basics, and I will be using Pro Tools as a primary tool to show some of this, but first I wanted to walk through some of the key terms that you should know. These will apply to any DAW, they will apply to any live console, and they apply in almost every situation that you'll find yourself in utilizing audio. Routing is essential. Signal flow and where the audio signal is at any time is essential to being an audio professional. And these are terms you need to know. So let's start off with the first one. This one gets thrown around and used in a variety of ways that are correct, but can be very confusing, I find, to new people in the industry and students. What is a bus? We use this term all the time. Hey, just, put that on a bus. Or like, hey, can you put more in my headphones? What bus is it on? These questions all make sense, but a bus as a fundamental concept is just a potential audio path, right? It's one path the audio could take. So the master output of your DAW is a bus, right? When you set up an effects loop in a DAW, you add a send to go to an effect. You're using a bus to get there. The bus is the transportation between two things. It takes you from one source to a destination. So you can think of it as a actual physical bus. Now, how we start and end that path, that trip, is up to us as an audio engineer. And this is a key part of being a professional in the field, is understanding not just how to use buses. Now that you know that that's a general term that doesn't mean that much, it's how do you route using buses? Where does it start? Where does it end? How do you make sure it doesn't come back into itself? And why might you do it? So I've put down a couple things here that are very common ways that a bus can be used. One that you'll find on websites and stuff as a definition, which is not the definition, but it is a common use, is to group tracks together. So you might have all of your drums going to one stereo bus. And that way you could bring down one fader instead of, if you had 6 microphones on a drum set, instead of all 6, right? Very common in live sound, very common in a recording studio. Another, and I get into this in a little more detail in a second, is to use a bus on a send to set up an effects loop. And this is a point in the audio track where we tap into the signal in an electronics context and duplicate it on a bus. So the signal continues into your main output, but it also can potentially go somewhere else. And that's how we set up effects loops. Often these are delays and reverbs. A third one that's very, very common, I think I just jumped. I'll jump back. Number 2 here is to send the audio down another path for a duplicate version. So this can be used in concepts called like parallel processing or parallel compression, where you want to take a track, create a duplicate version, and then affect it differently. So if you have a guitar track and then you want just a super distorted one that you'll bring up underneath the mix at the last chorus to make it even huger, you can do that using a bus, right? And you can do that in the analog domain as well. You can also use a bus, for example, to do the same thing with vocals, where you want to have some cool distorted effect. So you create a bus to another auxiliary track, which we'll talk about in a second, and then you can utilize both of those as essentially a duplicated file. Now, in a DAW, you might just literally duplicate the audio waveform onto another track and affect it that way, right? It's a similar process. But how do you do that if it's live? How do you do that if you're actually actively recording the part as it's being made? You have to do it with routing. You can't duplicate a live part on another track, right? And there's a lot you could get into with that, because in many digital consoles you could have the same input come into multiple channels. But that's sort of a different way to approach it. The fourth one here is to use is to set up headphone mixes and cue mixes, and this is, or monitor mixes, and this is what the musicians who are playing or recording hear in their headphones. Often when you're recording, a singer will want to hear more of themselves than anything else, or a guitar player will want to hear themselves and the snare drum, and like that's it. Maybe the bass, like they're like, those are the parts I need to hear. I don't care about the singer. I don't want to hear the singer. But if I'm in the control room, I need to hear the singer, even if the guitar player needs a totally different mix. And same thing in a live setting. When you're working with a live band, often stage volumes are pretty intense, and vocalists really, really need to hear themselves. So even on in-ears, one vocalist will want to make sure that they can hear themselves significantly louder than everything else that is on stage, as well as their fellow vocalists. And the last one is as a primary output, which I actually mentioned first. The main out of your computer is a bus, right? The main out of your console is a bus. It's a path the audio can take. It's master bus, master output. And you'll see that term as well. So that's what a bus is. It's a very generic term, and you can think of it as an actual bus. All right. Well, moving on. I mentioned this term. What is an aux? I said you could put it on an aux track and create an effects loop. What am I talking about? An aux track is a audio track that allows is a track that allows audio to pass through it. So it doesn't record audio, but it will allow audio to go through it. And on the way through it, you could affect it. You could affect it very simply by like adjusting the fader of an auxiliary track, or you could affect it very drastically by applying a bunch of processing to that track. So once again, if we go back to our drum example, the 6 drum mics have an output that is bus 10. So now all 6 of those mics, their main output is bus 10. Or if you're in stereo, you could do bus 9 and 10. Bus 10 is also the input of an auxiliary track. Remember, an auxiliary track just allows the audio to go through it. So all 6 of my drum tracks, however they're mixed, go to a sort of master. Their primary output is bus 10, which is an auxiliary track. And then on that auxiliary track, I can put in a compressor and some reverb and get a huge drum sound, which I then can adjust as a unit. You'll sometimes hear engineers talk about gluing the tracks together with groups or with bus compression. This is what they're referring to. They're referring to an auxiliary track with a bus as the input. The other way that we use aux tracks very commonly is as an effects loop. So I'm going to explain that briefly. This is where you send the audio from multiple different tracks into an auxiliary track that has some sort of audio processor on it, usually a temporal processor, which is a delay or a reverb. It's the most common use of aux track. There are hundreds of other uses, but that is the most common one. Delay or reverb. And so you have the ability to send it to a track that has just a reverb plugin on it. No audio is recorded, and you can increase that reverb by sending more signal into that track or decrease it by sending less. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'll show an example of this very soon. So the other term that I keep using is the word sends. And sends has a very specific meaning in audio as well. This is a point on each individual track, both an audio track and an aux track, but also on a master output track or even on MIDI tracks now with virtual instruments, where you can put a processor, where you can put a bus. That bus sits in a send on a track. I'm going to show this in a minute if that doesn't make sense. So a send in most DAWs are points on each channel where you could potentially put a bus. On an analog console, these are often already a bus. It's just defined that way. That's how the console is built. At each of these points, you could send some amount of the signal down that bus from that send. So these are the source points for a bus which goes to a destination per track. So on a bunch of audio tracks, I could have send A for all my drum tracks. On send A, I could have bus 1. And then on each of those, I could turn up bus 1 a little bit. Let's say I want it to go to an aux track with reverb. Well, I might not want any reverb on my kick drum. On my snare drum, I might want a lot of reverb. And on my overheads, I might want a little bit of reverb. So what I would do is select that bus on that send for each of those tracks and adjust the amount that goes down that bus to the auxiliary track with the reverb. So basically, I just turn up the reverb on the snare drum and turn up the reverb just a little bit on the overhead left and right, and not put any send level down the bus to the reverb track from the kick drum track. These also could be used for that headphone mix I talked about earlier, right? When I mentioned that the singer is going to want more of themselves and maybe some keyboard so that they can match pitch and make sure they can hear that, but they don't want the snare drum bashing them in the face in their headphones. That's fine. They want to be able to maybe hear it a little bit, but they don't need it like ka ka ka. Whereas a bass player might be like, I need to hear the snare drum. Like I have to be right with that snare drum, right? And they want different mixes. Well, how do we give them different mixes, especially if it's 6 or 7 different musicians who all want different mixes, right? As an engineer, that's a lot. And you're still trying to create a mix that sounds good in the room where everyone comes back in and is like, oh, that sounds great. Yeah, man, I can hear myself. I'm the loudest. And that never happens. But if it does, congrats. And in a live sound setting, it's the same situation. So that is what a send is. You can use those sends on each individual track. Interesting, you can also use sends on aux tracks, so you could have something like a delay on an aux track which receives from bus 4, and all your audio tracks have bus 4, and you turn up a little delay in a vocal or whatever, and then you could have a send on the vocal track or on the reverb track that goes to the headphones so that my vocalists can hear some reverb and it sounds more natural, which is pretty cool. Okay, so then there's this last term. What is an insert then? Because you'll see both of these in most audio systems. An insert is a point on the path on a channel, audio channel, or an auxiliary channel, or a master, where you can put an audio processor. Now, it only affects the material on that track. So for specific audio channels, this might be, and most common probably, is a high pass filter, right? I can get rid of all that low end crap I don't need on anything really except kick drum and bass drum. And the next thing is probably an equalizer. So even the most basic small little consoles for a DJ will have at least a little bit of equalization. We can turn up the highs or turn up the lows or something like that. That's an insert. It only affects channel 3. That's it. It does not affect any other channel. You could also put that on an aux track where a bunch of channels come into it. And now I'm affecting a group of channels with an insert. So once again, our drum example. Our 6 drum mics all go out bus 10. The primary output of all 6 of the drum channels is bus 10. Bus 10 is the input for an auxiliary drum group track, an aux track. And on that auxiliary drum group track, as an insert, I put an equalization plugin. And what I want is a little more high-end out of my drums, the whole drum set. Well, I can just go to that aux track on the insert and turn up the high end. I don't have to click on each of my equalizers for each of those 6 tracks and like try to turn up the high end. Now, if I want, I still could do that, right? I could go back and just make the snare drum have more high end, and that would be an insert on the snare drum track. If I have an insert on a group of tracks, it affects everything on those tracks. So the insert is a primary way that we affect the audio only on that track. One thing that is easy to get in the habit of, but as you have larger and larger sessions can become an issue, is putting the same insert, especially temporal processors, delays and reverbs, across multiple tracks. You're like, man, I really love the sound of this reverb. I'm just going to duplicate it on all 12 of these vocal tracks. Well, now you're running 12 instances of that plugin. And for example, right now I'm working on a session that has well over 200 tracks in it. And you can't do that. It bogs down the computer. And I have a pretty powerful computer. You just can't do it. It's far more efficient to set up an auxiliary track and use sends than it would be in that instance to use inserts to get the exact same reverb on multiple tracks, right? So we're going to jump away from this, all these words, and we're going to jump over and take a look at Pro Tools. And in Pro Tools, what you're going to see is a very, very basic session that I've set up the mix window here on the left, and I've set up the edit window here on the right, and it just has a little bit of audio, which I'm going to test to make sure is coming through or not.
This is a recording.
All right, I got a little bit of distortion going on there. That's not ideal.
This is a recording.
Mm-hmm.
This is a recording.
All right, that'll work. Not ideal, but we're going to go with it.
This is a recording.
Cool. So we have this little recording of me on this microphone, which has some pre-processing as an insert before it hit the Pro Tools input channel here. And we're going to see how the tracks here in the edit window correlate to the tracks here in the mix window, as well as walk through some of these terms we just defined. And we're also going to look a little bit at the I/O of Pro Tools and kind of show how that works, if I can get the zoom bar out of the way. Okay, great. So hopefully you'll be able to see some of these things, because I can't tell. First, if we take a look at these inserts, get a little water, I get a little parched. All right, if we take a look, this is an individual audio track here in blue. Next to it is an auxiliary track here in green, and then there's a master fader. This is what I would recommend in every session. You might have many of these, but you should at least have these. You should have a master output so you can monitor your master and make sure you are not peaking.
This is a recording
On your master. Now, a bus is just a path audio can potentially take. So there are two primary types of buses in a DAW situation. The first is a internal bus, which allows you to route route the audio within the system, in the software. It doesn't leave the software. So if we go to the sends, which you now know what that term means, we can click there and you can see there's a lot of stuff going on, but one of them is bus. And here I have bus 1 through 24 as well as stereo buses. For our purposes, we'll just use bus 1. And you'll see this little fader, I hope you can see this, just popped up. If you can't, I'm going to change my view a little bit here at the top. Expanded sends B. So you can actually see the fader, which is the amount of signal on this send, which is send B. Now, I can also apply sends to auxiliary tracks here, right? So if I have multiple audio tracks, I'll add another one here. Well, I could also put a bus 1 on send B of this next track. We'll call it track 2. Fancy. Each of these now has a bus on the send, which is not going anywhere. Some DAWs do a lot of automatic stuff. When you add a bus, or you add a bus on a send, they put in an aux track and all sorts of things. I think there's some merit to that, but I feel like it's very limiting in that when the software developers make the decision to dictate how you set these things up, they restrict your ability to be creative with how you might use them. So having a basic understanding of how they work, I think, is actually far more flexible and far more interesting what you can end up doing and how you might use them. And you can also, well, yeah. So here we have bus 1. Now I'll go to this aux track and I'll set up a bus, I'll set up an input on this aux track as bus 1. So now this send is going to this track, the auxiliary track, but as you can see here, I'm not sending any signal. So I'm going to play this audio back, and what I want you to do is watch this aux track. See what happens.
This is a recording.
Nothing there.
This is a recording.
Oh.
This is a recording. This is
and you can see,
a recording.
You can see as I turned up this fader, or this fader, it's the same one, you can see them both moving, level comes into our aux track here. So here's a little beady box. Now it's gone, now it's there. And we could do the same here on this second track. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a temporal processor on the auxiliary track. Check it out. Ow. Ow. That's a delay, which is a temporal processor. And we'll do something that's very obvious, and the church plugin is just over the top weird, in my opinion. It's huge, crazy amounts of stuff. I'm going to set it 100% wet, so whatever's coming down this path now is going to hit this reverb. And I'm going to start with it down. Here, I'll show you both of these big faders. Makes it a little more obvious, I think. I'm going to start with it down, and then I'm going to bring it up. So here we go. Oh yeah, we got that little 7/8 bar at the end there. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that. As I brought this up, I had more and more reverb, and then I could adjust. So if I want a little reverb here, a little bit on the second track, or if this is our kick drum, we bring it all the way down. If this is our snare, maybe we push it up. And we could go in and add whatever we want on this particular auxiliary track. And we have just created, do you know? An effects loop. Correct. You got it. So if I do something like a distortion plugin, pre-reverb, now when I send, or let's say we just wanted a sort of parallel distortion track. So I'm going to bypass the reverb and I'm going to bring up the distortion. Or I'm bringing up the send to the distortion. Off. On. And you can hear how much bigger that sounds. So that's some basic routing using a bus on a send to an aux with an insert. Boom! How about them apples? Okay. I always go on too long. All right, here we go though. We're gonna keep it moving now. The other one, so the first type of bus I just explained, and this is where I started. The first type of bus is an internal bus. These buses, in Pro Tools at least, bus 1 through whatever, 24 if you're in HD, you can go up to 128, I think. Those are internal buses, but there's also external buses, which are our main outs. These are pathways that the audio can take that are physically mapped. In my case, they're just mapped to the they say that they're software returns, but they're anyway, they're physical outputs on the interface, right? And so this is not set up correctly right now, but this first one is actually an ADAT, which is an optical out that then goes to an interface which converts that digital signal to analog and then outputs to my main speakers. So that is a physical output. And that is also technically a bus. It's my master bus output. Two types of buses. They are exactly the same thing, though. It's paths the audio can take. Now, let's go in here and let's talk a little bit about the setup in Pro Tools of these things so you can see it. This will be similar in most DAWs. There are some exceptions, especially really simple programs like Audacity and stuff, where you don't have that much control over I/O, but you can still get in there. You can still do it. The first thing we can look at is our actual hardware. So I clicked on Setup and Hardware in the top menu, and you can see my DigiFace USB device. So that's sort of physically what Pro Tools is looking at. There are actually other steps in there, but that's what I have Pro Tools actually look at. And then if you go down to I/O, which stands for inputs and outputs, you can look at those individual various inputs, physical inputs, and physical outputs. I'm going to stop the sharing just so I can make sure that you actually can see this, because it's kind of important. It looks to me like you can, but here, I'll do it this way. All right, in this I/O, you can see your physical inputs. In my case, they're all ADAT, and those are mapped according to whatever you want them to be, really. And that's the beauty of an I/O matrix like this in Pro Tools and most programs. So I have 1 and 2, but those could be mapped to other locations if you ultimately wanted that to happen. You'd need to clear out space and kind of move them around. And you can also go in and label these. So you could call this, I'll call the stereo one, main out 1, 2. Now, that's, oh, sorry, this is the inputs. My fault. And you can see it renamed what was underneath that as well, which is great. But just the point is you can relabel all these. So this would be main out 1 and 2. And if you remember on our actual track, it originally said ADAT 1 and 2. When we switch back, it will say main out 1 and 2. And we could move it around. Like that physical output could actually be anything we want it to be as long as you have an output available. Obviously, if you don't have an output available, you can't make it that. And you'll also see our buses here. And what we're looking at is the out 1 and 2, main out 1 and 2, which then feeds our main out here, is a bus. This is why I hate when you go to Wikipedia and look up bus. And it's like, it's a group of audio tracks. No, it's not. As well as you can see some inserts here. And inserts can potentially be physical inserts as well, in Pro Tools at least, where you route out to a physical piece of equipment and then back in. And sometimes that has latency, and then you might have to deal with hardware latency issues, which you'll have to figure out. So that's your I/O setup in Pro Tools. What's nice about this is you can set up your I/O, label it how you want. If you have a specific one for a specific band, you could have inputs that say like vocal Mike, vocal Chelsea, vocal Leo, drums kick, drum kick, sub kick, drum snare 57, etc. And you can actually then go through, export these settings, and save them. So when you go to a different studio, you can bring that all in, be ready to go, which is very useful. Especially I've found in surround mixing, where studios sometimes have the different channels routed differently. Like it'll be left, right, center, sub, left, rear, right, or other studios will have left, center, right, left, rear, sub. And you're like, so if you have a different set of options, especially for your outputs, it can be very useful because you don't sit there just messing around until you figure it out. Anyway, that's what's going on there. And I hope that in going through some of that stuff, in seeing these key terms like bus, aux, send, and insert, and some of those definitions and how you can, in a very quick way, utilize these, you've learned some things about audio routing. So until next time, make some noise.